The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to Urban Fantasies, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to our first show of the new year. Yes, it's 2018 and bizarrely nobody is predicting we'll all be swept away by an apocalypse before the next 12 months are out, which in my books is a very good start to the year. Things can only get better. I'm Charles Christian and with me is Janie.
Hi everyone. So what's in store for us this time? As she says, pretending she hasn't read the script.
We're off to the pantomime.
Oh no, we're not.
Oh yes we are.
Oh no, we're not. And it's behind you.
What is?
Anyway, we went to the Pento last week, didn't we?
Yes we did. But we can still talk about pantomimes.
Okay, go on.
Okay, right. I'm just fascinated by Pantos. I've been going to them for years, and it's all the legends and traditions associated with them. I mean, you just take the cast. The hero, the principal boy, is always played by a young woman, and the costume leaves you in no doubt it's a young woman. And the heroine, the principal girl, is also played by a young woman. They fall in love, and at the end, they get together. There's usually a marriage ceremony or something of that nature. The hero's mother, or possibly the heroine's mother, the dame, is played by a man dressed as a woman. And at the end of the show, he usually gets together with the elderly male, the baron or some such character, the alderman, and they get together. And we all regard this as good, clean family fun and something to take the kiddies to.
Which it is. I mean, it's just very modern now, but obviously back then wasn't so much. But yeah, that's all cool.
It's all cool with you. That's good. Yes, I think for people who've never been to a panto before, you do need to check out your reservations about innuendo and things like that.
Oh yes, best bit actually, I find.
Yes. You can't really not have it when you've got a panto with like Dick Whittington with.
Does lend itself to a few
Dick jokes, yes.
It does, rather. Yes, yeah. Anyway, I mean, when was the first panto you saw?
Well, I was a small child. I was 3 and I was taken to see a panto, and it began the usual way with the lights going dark and a flash of lightning and a crash of thunder, and then the Demon King leaps on stage and goes, ha 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 ha, in an evil way. And I started crying and had to be taken home, and that was the end of my panto.
Oh, yeah, that happened last week, didn't it? I saw a few parents taking out shrieking children, never to be seen again.
Yes.
Yeah, my first panto was when I was about 56. And, yes, well, we didn't
What kept you?
we didn't do frivolity in our house. Oh, no. So I think it was when you took me to the panto, and it was a revelation, and that's when I decided I'd like to be in a panto, and I did do a few pantos, and it was great because the scope for the comedy is marvellous, and the innuendo. I mean, you can get away with stuff in a panto that you couldn't in other productions, so I thought it was great, actually.
For people unfamiliar with pantos, it's worth noting that the cast nowadays comprises, in many shows, just actors, but increasingly you have stars in there, pop stars, members of faded boy bands, reality TV stars, and increasingly visiting stars from the US. Henry Winkler, the Fonz, David Hasselhoff, who is frequently over here playing Captain Hook. Other visitors from the US include Pamela Anderson and even Elvis's former wife Priscilla Presley. Even more weirdly, this year has seen a number of former UK politicians, such as Anne Widdecombe, appear in panto. Who knows, 5 or 6 years' time we could be seeing Donald Trump playing Baron Hardup in Panto at the Birmingham Hippodrome.
No comment from me over here. I mean, there's just too much material to work with.
And maybe be able to live tweet from it. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, for our first pantomime-related story, I'm looking at the background and folklore surrounding one of the UK's favourite pantos, The Tale of the Babes in the Wood.
Yes, that means you're about to kill the magic on that one, isn't it?
Yes. No more smiles. Keeping with our theme of pantomimes, and moving on from our tale in the last show about the mistletoe bride clasped in her living tomb, today we encounter the equally cheery tale of 2 young children who were abandoned and left to die in a forest before eventually being buried in a pile of leaves by Robin Redbreast and his woodland friends. Yes, this is the original story of the Babes in the Wood pantomime, although over the centuries the tale has been extended to give it a happier ending. The first version of the story, the not exactly snappily entitled The Norfolk Gent, His Will and Testament, and How He Committed the Keeping of His Children to His Own Brother, Who Dealt Most Wickedly with Them, and How God Plagued Him for It, usually abbreviated to The Children in the Wood or The Norfolk Tragedy, was first published as a morality story by Thomas Millington in Norwich in 1595. The story tells of 2 young children, the Babes, a boy and a girl, who were left in the care of an uncle after their parents' premature death. The terms of the will were the family fortune would pass to the children unless they died before reaching adulthood, in which case the uncle would inherit the entire estate. So you'll not be surprised to learn the uncle was unwilling to leave this arrangement entirely to fate and hired a couple of thugs to ensure the children disappeared. The pretext was the men were to take the children to London to be educated, but, depending on the version of the story being told, the thugs either abandoned the children without food, water or shelter in the depths of a forest, or they quarrelled over the best way to dispose of the children, and while fighting amongst themselves, with one thug killing the other, the 2 children fled deep into the forest and became irreparably lost, and in due course the children, wandering alone, died of hunger and exposure, whereupon the birds covered them in leaves. By the standards of the 16th century, it should be noted, it was important for people to receive a proper burial rather than just to be left to rot in the open. Being a morality story, the tale continues with a description of the divine retributions that subsequently befell the wicked uncle. These included his barns burning down, his crops failing, his cattle dying, his own children drowning at sea on a journey to Portugal, before the uncle himself was declared a bankrupt and died in a debtor's prison. It's a grim story, and Millington's tale continued to circulate and become ever more popular over the next couple of centuries, going on to be adapted for the stage in 1793 and in as early as 1827 being rewritten as a pantomime. Curiously, for the first few years of being performed as a panto, the story retained its tragic conclusion, lightened only by the spirits of the children being reunited with their parents in heaven, which apparently in those days passed for a happy ending. However, in 1867, the panto version was given a more drastic rewrite, with the second half of the show opening with the Babes, sometimes called Dot and Trot, being rescued from their fate by none other than Robin Hood and his merry men, complete with Maid Marian, who became the children's governess. This is broadly the version still being performed today, with the wicked uncle sometimes depicted as the Sheriff of Nottingham, and the whole show climaxing in the defeat of the uncle sheriff, and the children restored to their rightful inheritance. In fact, somewhere in my family archives is a photograph of my mother playing Dot in a 1930s production of the pantomime. But anyway, where did Thomas Millington in Norwich first draw his inspiration in 1595, given that it would appear to be an original tale rather than be based upon older folklore? The most likely suggestion is the story is based upon a true event that took part at Griston Hall near Wotton in Norfolk, which is just over 20 miles from where Millington would have been in Norwich, and it had occurred about 30 years earlier in the 1560s. According to the story, a certain Thomas de Grey Sr. died leaving his home, Griston Hall, its estates and all his income to his 7-year-old son, Thomas Jr. But as he was so young, the boy was made a ward of court, and a marriage was arranged with another child called Elizabeth Drury. Such arrangements were not unusual in the Tudor and Elizabethan England and were primarily to protect property interests and had nothing to do with romance or the concerns of the two children in question. However, it was also a part of the original will that should Thomas die before reaching adulthood, the entire inheritance would pass to his uncle Robert de Grey. 4 years later, in 1566, the uncle sent Thomas away to visit his stepmother, his late father's second wife, but while there or en route, Thomas Jr. mysteriously died and Robert inherited the estate. Just like the pantomime. Robert de Grey was a Roman Catholic in a mainly Anglican part of Norfolk, which didn't make him many friends in an era of religious upheaval and persecution, and soon there were rumours that the boy had been murdered on the uncle's orders while travelling through nearby Wayland Wood. Robert didn't help his cause by subsequently attempting to seize the dower funds, that's the money provided for the bride should the husband die before her, promised to Elizabeth Drury. The Drury family fought back and commenced legal proceedings to recover the dower funds, and in fact for the rest of his life Robert de Grey faced legal problems. He was later fined and imprisoned in Norwich and in London for recuscancy. This is failing to attend Anglican church services, which was required by law at the time, and is said to have died disgraced and bankrupt. In a further similarity to Millington's original ballad, there is evidence that Robert's own sons never returned from a military expedition to Portugal in 1588. It's even been suggested that the tale about the Robins burying the children may have been an allusion to Robin, see what he did there, his nephew, and covering up the evidence. With the disgrace of Robert and the lack of any de Grey heirs, Griston Hall changed ownership and was extensively rebuilt. A new wing was added, and local legend has it the rooms were named The Babes, The Wicked Uncle, and Robin Redbreast. It's also said the fireplaces in these rooms had mantelpieces carved with scenes from Millington's ballad, including the Robins. Unfortunately, these have subsequently been lost. Whatever the truth of the story, this area of Norfolk is now firmly Babes in the Wood territory. There was an old oak in Wayland Wood that, until it was destroyed in the late 19th century, became a tourist attraction because reputed to be the place where the babes sheltered on the night they died. 100 years ago, you could even buy postcards of Griston Hall clearly marked as the Wicked Uncle's house. And even today, the village of Griston and the town of Wotton feature the babes on their civic signs. Sadly, the spookiest legend that has grown up in the area, that Wayland Wood derives its name from Wailing Wood because it is haunted by the ghostly sounds of sobbing children, is without foundation. For as long as goes the Domesday Book in 1086, this part of the Norfolk woodlands was called Waynlone. So Waynlone becomes Wayland, not Wailing. But there you have it. The sad tale and the original source for Babes in the Wood. Now for our latest on this weird day in history. The date is the 4th of January, and we start with a little space travel item for all you geeks. On the 4th January 1958, incredibly 60 years ago from now, the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, fell from orbit and burned up in the Earth's atmosphere after a flight lasting 3 months and including 1,440 orbits of the Earth. finally, let me wish Baron Frankenstein's monster many happy returns from the dead, as the Mary Shelley novel was first published 200 years ago on the 1st of January 1818.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
We've been talking a lot in this show about the folklore and background to some of the most popular Christmas stories and pantomimes. But what about the actors' perspective? How do they view these things? Recently I spoke to 3 actors, Simon Michael Morgan, Steve Peck and Hayley Evnett, about some of the acting profession's superstitions and beliefs. At the time of the interview, all 3 of them were appearing in a production of the pantomime Dick Whittington and His Cat at the Fisher Theatre in Bungay. Simon was playing Alderman Fitzwarren and his twin brother, Captain Horatio. Strangely, the 2 were never seen on stage at the same time. Steve played King Rat, the villain of the story, and Hayley played our hero, Dick Whittington. You're all here, you're doing a spooky pantomime with rats and demon kings and things like that.
Yeah, rat kings. Yeah.
Rat kings, yes, as you get.
Yeah.
Tell us something about the folklore and superstition associated with pantomimes and the stage and things like that.
Gosh.
Well, it's obviously probably one of the main ones people think about when you say about theatre is the Scottish play, which I'm certainly very against saying. It's a play obviously full of superstitions in itself, so it's generally quite bad luck to say the name of said play, which I will not say as we're in a theatre right now. Yes. I myself have had a lot of experience where that word has cropped up and bad things have happened. I fell out of a wicker coffin, or nearly fell out of a wicker coffin. One time it was mentioned, and another time I had a panic attack on stage. So I wonder if the 2 things are related. It might just be me, but I'm very superstitious about that sort of thing.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve, you can see. No, I mean, I would just say, I think if you go back to the roots of it in broad terms, you're kind of looking at theatre as being a kind of sacred storytelling event that has a sort of mysticism surrounding it, kind of going back to when humans first gained access to the imagination, conscious access to it, and how shamans would dance around the fire and tell mystical stories about the beasts they'd hunted and what have you. So I think there's quite a profound kind of almost spiritual component underpinning all the kind of freaky folklore that we get around theatre.
Yeah. I'm sure there are people out there who can correct me, but I believe the reason why it's bad luck is because it's one of Shakespeare's shortest plays. So if you mentioned it, you'd be damning your own financial success.
That's why we went into the profession after all, because it's just the money's so good.
Oh, the money's so
good. And it's full-time employment, isn't it?
Oh, constant.
Sorry, let me just take off my gold earphones. What did you just say?
Well, it's the same as the saying good luck to someone is notoriously bad luck.
Yeah,
and people
not
say,
as bad luck, but yeah, it's bad luck.
But is thank you. Whereas break a leg, people tend to say now instead.
Do they really say that?
Well, I don't like to say that either, to be honest. I've moved on to
good
good
house.
house.
Is it a sort of media cliche that's what you say?
I think so. I mean, the thing behind that was breaking the leg line, wasn't it? Was the thing
Well,
about...
there are many, but one of them is the leg line. Sorry, I'll just mansplain to Hayley.
No, please, I'll go and you can continue.
The leg line of the stage.
Yes,
the
of course, which meant you'd get paid if you crossed the leg line, meant you got onto the stage. So you get paid, but then it's been adopted by other people maybe not necessarily in the profession.
Vaudeville, yeah, because of course there'd be lots of acts trying to get on stage, and if one dropped out, you might get your shot.
Right.
So I hope you break the leg,
yes.
and whatnot. Other ideas are
stamping, isn't it?
Stamping the legs of the chairs. It goes back to the Romans or the Greeks that I've heard. I'm not sure if they did have what we would term as chairs now. I thought they would probably have benches or things like that. Stone seats, but yeah, perhaps maybe your show be so good that they break the legs of the chairs, and
Yes.
So that's what I've heard.
Yeah, I've heard one. Yeah, about curtains that you should.
Yeah.
You've got so many curtain calls that it breaks the leg holding up the curtains.
Oh
Yeah.
right. No, but another one with curtains that you shouldn't go into the auditorium through the curtains. If you're going into the auditorium, you have to go around the outside or
I
something.
think that's just a professionalism thing, I
yeah.
think, to an extent as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
Depends
that's
how much time you've got, but yeah.
Sacred space.
Yeah.
sacred space.
And we had one this morning about whistling.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's mariner ropes.
Well,
Is it?
that's,
That's
they
right,
used to
isn't
use, like, old stagehands used to be mariners,
Yeah.
like, and so they'd use all the rigging and everything. So their way of communicating with each other was through a series of coded whistles. So if you whistled on stage, it might mean drop that heavy light on stage, and you might be underneath it. So generally, that's seen as a big superstitious thing as well in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't like it. It gives my hair crawling.
Yeah.
Or whistling.
Yeah, in theatre, I'm quite superstitious.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? We've got so many of these ingrained things, and when we're sat here now talking about where they come from and how actually they are maybe in many ways very practical and very obvious, but there is that sense of creepiness and oddness about them. And I think that's just to do with the fact that, as Steve was saying, it is a sacred space. It is an ancient, primordial sense of storytelling. Because as human beings, we want to tell each other stories. You know, we want to tell have those experiences.
It's such a live event as well, and in a space of an hour, 2 hours, potentially your whole career could go
Yeah,
down the
exactly.
pan just by something going wrong. So in a way, we do want everything to go right. I know people who wear lucky pairs of pants, depending on what sort of a mood they're in at the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I've been acting now 20 odd years, and I'm not religious in any way. I'm not a Christian or anything like that. I'd probably call myself a humanist if anything. However, I always cross myself in the Catholic way before I go on stage. Yes.
I genuflect.
I genuflect. No, I don't quite genuflect, but I do.
Yes.
I've always done that, and it's just because it's just something that's one of my little traditions.
Yeah, same. Certain warm-ups and things.
Yeah.
I certainly have, and I know if I don't do a certain warm-up, I'm more likely to get injured. And when
There's always a piece of the script as well, a piece of the words I got to say there, that I will repeat before I go on stage.
Yes.
I'll always make sure that that's part of that. My warm-up's done now.
Little rituals.
Yeah, little rituals.
if I don't
we
do
all
that,
have
it
to
will all
do.
go out of my head, and I won't
Yeah.
know what I'm doing. Yeah,
It's bizarre.
it's very strange.
But very, very human, I think, and probably quite shows how much of an how ill we all are as actors, and how much we need mental health therapy.
Yeah, dude, that's the amount of alcohol
Caring the
you drink
community.
to get through. That's a key indicator.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
pantomime has its own kind of, not necessarily superstitions, but more kind of a equation really about it, isn't it? It's got the ways it's been started, just through the traditions, through how it's grown throughout history. So the certain things you have, the good side is, because the stage is divided in heaven and hell, so you've got side of good is usually stage left. Oh no, stage right, and evil is usually stage left. Whereas on our one we've got it.
Yeah, we've reversed it.
We've reversed it for
Yeah.
one reason or another,
Yeah.
made for access. But usually that was the way. So good fairy would be on stage right, and evil rat, for example, would be on stage left. And that's
Because
just
left
how
was
that
always
is.
seen as wrong, wasn't it? Left-handed people were always seen as...
Is that from the audience's perspective or your perspective?
From our
Stage
perspective as
left. Stage
actors.
left.
So when you're, as the audience, when you're watching, you should be seeing good on the left side and evil on the right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And things like that.
It's kind of, that kind of runs counter to the whole thing of like left-handed people being evil and.
Well, maybe.
Well, that it always was. If you were a left-handed
I love
single
left-handed
woman in the
people.
16th century, 17th century, you'd be looked at as a witch, wouldn't
Oh,
you?
yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, you left-handed, Hayley.
No, but my lovely partner in crime is, so.
Yeah.
So
He's a
I
witch.
love left-handed people.
He's a witch.
But
Anyway, we'll get back to what we were talking about.
So yeah, so it's all that kind of thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
And there's certain joke routines that have become standard, the ghost gag that we've got in this one, and certain other ones as well, and the oh no it isn't, and oh yes it is, they're ingrained in our tradition as well. I did a lot of touring in Germany,
Yes.
and the Germans found pantomime to be delightfully absurd, Whereas, of course, I think it's traditionally it's such a British thing, isn't it?
Well, it originated from Commedia dell'arte back in Italy, and then it's one with the touring and extra things. It kind of spread around Europe and then came to Britain, and we adopted it and adapted it to our own ends, keeping the original kind of structure with how they had with the stock characters, which we've now adapted into sort of through Victorian theatre, and then using the framework that was still there. So Panto Boy and Panto Girl originally were played both by women, and you would have the old woman played by the man, and there'd be some sort of chase in the middle, which was with slapstick and music and all sorts of things, which has gradually come down to being like a routine, like the mop routine and things like that. But yeah, and we've adapted it, and we adapted it to be part of folk stories and things like that, to make it more of a kind of worded structure rather than a dumb show. And I think the first one that Britain ever did, I don't know, but one of the first ones they did was George and the Dragon. And they took that and adapted that, and that was one of the first pantomimes for Britain. So it was a very kind of traditionally British story that was turned into.
And the bawdiness,
panto.
The bawdiness kind of came from the Restoration period, I think.
Oh yeah. Having women playing boys and things.
Just all those. I mean, it was the Restoration period. You've got. There was no innuendo at all.
No subtlety.
No subtlety at all. You had protagonists with costumes that actually had gigantic phalluses and whatnot, and
emphasising the women playing the boys, so breeches and things like
all that kind of stuff. Which is kind of now, I think, over the centuries, kind of been watered down to a bit more just double entendre. We hope. Not in ours today, but
a bit more carry on, really.
Yeah, a bit more carry on. Yeah.
Dick Whittington.
Lots of Dick.
Yes.
And Whittington.
Yes. Any other ones you can think of? Conscious
Superstitions. Oh, there's a light. Isn't there meant to be a light to ward off evil spirits upstage centre? But I think it's more of a kind of thing that people do just to make sure you don't cross a completely black stage and injure yourself. But there's meant to be a thing in theatres where they put a very small light upstage centre just for people, like if there's a complete blackout, to be able to find their way off the stage, which seems sensible, but I think it's kind of, people also say it's a way to ward off the evil spirits off the stage. And
every
that sort
theatre
of
has
thing.
their ghosts, of course. I think
you met one this morning, didn't
Fisher
you?
Theatre. Fisher Theatre here in Bungay has a playful ghost called Abigail, apparently, a small girl, who was originally called Sophie, but by all accounts, according to Corey, who works here, she didn't like the name Sophie, so now she's called Abigail. And she moves costumes and things like that. So, yeah.
You thought you saw it.
I thought I saw her this morning as well. But
Looking back at you.
Looking back at me.
But actually it was me.
In a wig.
In a wig. Yeah, so...
But yeah, I think what that sort of the candle thing illustrates, I think the other ones as well, is that there was a practical dimension to all these traditions, wasn't there?
Yeah.
That as the need for those practicalities kind of dissipated, and sort of kept that kind of like, well, we have to have that because it's always been there. It's bad luck not to have it or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you did do anything like, say Macca's or anything like that, you're meant to go out of the theatre, turn round, is it anti-clockwise or clockwise or something?
Clockwise, I think.
Clockwise 3 times and shout a Shakespearean profanity or something. Of course. that makes perfect sense. And then you'll be fine.
Yeah.
I tend to... If someone says the Scottish play, I tend to just shake it off,
Yeah.
Like it's finishing a warm-up or something. I just shake it off. No, I didn't hear that.
I usually shout, "Get out."
Yeah. But, people get really... Actors, and I think, right,
Yes.
so, because it really is that division between amateurism and professionalism. You've got to have respect for what you're doing, I think. So I think that's where it comes from in many ways as well. Don't you mess around with our traditions. Don't you mess around with the fabric of what we're trying to achieve here by making fun of us. I think that's kind of what it comes down to as well. I don't think any of us...
We make fun of ourselves.
Yeah, we'll make fun of ourselves. I don't think
Very
any...
serious pantomime, yes.
Yes.
I don't know.
I don't think any true actor, you know, a professional actor, I don't think anyone in their right mind really believes that saying...
Yeah,
I can't
don't
bring
have
myself
to say. You don't have to say.
I can't bring, saying the Scottish play will actually bring bad luck upon the production, but we don't risk it, do we?
It's happened to me twice. It's happened to me twice, and fool me once, fool me twice.
Yeah, you're setting up the expectation. If it's a thing that people believe, you're setting up the expectation to be fulfilled.
And you put
And if anything goes wrong afterwards, you immediately put it down to
saying the Scottish play.
saying the So
Yeah.
you know,
There you go.
There you go.
yeah. You know, I said the word, and 10 years later, I got very old.
Mirrors. Oh yeah, you're not meant to have peacock feathers on stage. The eye of the peacock is meant to be very bad luck.
Oh, yes, evil eye and all that.
You're not meant to have actual mirrors. Health and safety wise, you probably shouldn't have mirrors on stage anyway, but I think it messes with the lights too. There was something else as well, you know. Oh, real money and real jewellery. Probably more of a safety thing. You might just lose something really important.
Safety and budgetary.
Yeah,
It's what the producers made
thieves.
up.
Thieving actors.
We're not putting any valuables in your grasp, in your reach.
There you go. That's another thing.
That's brilliant. Well, Steve, Simon, Hayley, break a leg.
Thank you. Hey! Thank you very much.
Dick Whittington with Simon, Steve and Hayley was the panto we actually went to see last week. Mm-hmm. Wasn't it funny though? The child we took to see it hid in the foyer as we went on stage at the end for photos with the cast, because he's at that stage where adults are just a complete embarrassment. Mind you, we were quite embarrassing, I have to say. But anyway.
Little outrageous, yes.
Yes. Well, we're hams, aren't we, darling? We're lovies.
We are.
We're just the spotlight, the paint, the smell, the burning
Grease paint.
Yeah. It's in our blood, darling. Anyway, this got me thinking, and I did some research into the background of Dick Whittington. So here are 5 things you may not know about the story.
Fire away.
Okay. Firstly, there's a real-life inspiration for the story, namely a 14th century London merchant and a politician called Sir Richard Whittington. Mm-hmm. Secondly, although in the pantomime the chiming Bow Bells say, "Turn again, Dick Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London," the real-life Richard Whittington served as Lord Mayor for not 3, but 4 terms of office. Mm. Thirdly, just as in the panto, the real Richard Whittington actually did marry an Alice Fitzwarren. Okay. Not that fascinating, but never mind. Fourthly, the real Richard Whittington was a great benefactor to London's poor, leaving his entire fortune, he was worth millions of pounds in today's money, I don't know exactly how much, to charities and good causes. And during his lifetime, he even paid for the construction of a 128-seat public toilet that was flushed out twice daily, that much, at high tide by the River Thames. I don't know about you, but I'd like to see a photo of that. But I'm guessing there isn't. Anyway.
It was apparently the first public toilet as well, where the women had a separate seating from the men.
Ah. Anyway, there's nothing I can say about that.
No.
Fifthly and finally, there is sadly no evidence he had a magic cat, or even any cat at all. Even the portraits of him that purport to show him stroking a cat were doctored to include a Moggy a couple of 100 years after his death.
So where did the cat come from?
It seems that somewhere along the way, an old but popular folk tale about a poor orphan gaining a fortune through his cat got combined with a story of Richard Whittington, in the same way the tale of the Babes in the Woods was merged with the legend of Robin Hood, sort of for dramatic effect.
And of course London would have been overrun with rats during that era, still is. And then there were the plagues of those days, particularly the Black Death, which had just ended before the real Richard Whittington was born, and the Great Plague in 1665. So any story that had cats killing rats would have been a crowd pleaser.
Yeah, there is one curious footnote to the story of the cat. The real-life Sir Richard was buried within the precincts of the Church of St Michael Paternoster Royal. And the location of that tomb has now been lost, but when the church was being rebuilt after the Second World War, the builders did find the body of a very old mummified cat.
Time now for another foray into the world of black magic and witchcraft trials with the tale of the Witch of Eye. It's an odd one in that, unusually for an English witchcraft case, the condemned witch was burned at the stake rather than hanged. It also gives us an insight into some of the sorcery actually being practised 600 years ago. From the first appearance of Morgan Le Fay in Geoffrey of Monmouth's version of the Arthurian legends, through to Melisandre in George R.R. Martin's The Game of Thrones, people have been telling stories of wicked witches who use black magic to overthrow kings. But has there ever been a real-life historical model for such a person? In England, the prime candidate is Marjorie Jourdemain, or Jordan, better known as the Witch of Eye, who in 1441 was accused of heretical witchcraft as a part of a larger plot against King Henry VI. In fact, Marjorie's case was so notorious she even features in William Shakespeare's play The History of Henry VI, Part 2. However, before we meet Marjorie Jourdemain, let's set the historical scene. On the throne is King Henry VI, the only child of Henry V, a monarch who had created an empire during the long-running 100 Years' War, in which the kings of England controlled more of France than the kings of France. Following the unexpected death of King Henry V at the age of 36, his son acceded to the throne and all the powers of the state were exercised by a regency council comprising the leading dukes and earls of the realm. Predictably, the nobles were more interested in what they could personally gain from being associated with the Regency Council, and very quickly dynastic splits began emerging as rival families vied for power and influence over the king. Among the most influential was King Henry V's youngest brother, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, who held the position of Lord Protector and Defender of the Realm. In 1428, Humphrey had his first marriage annulled so he could marry his mistress, Eleanor Cobham, a woman variously described as beautiful, intelligent and ambitious. Over the next few years, Humphrey and Eleanor lived at Les Plaisance, their own palace at Greenwich, which rivaled the royal court in terms of luxury. Then, in 1435, Humphrey's elder brother, John, the Duke of Bedford, died. This not only made Humphrey the most influential member of the Regency Council, but also the heir presumptive to the English throne. The key point here is Henry VI was still a minor, unmarried, and had no children, so if he were to die, the crown would pass to the late Henry V's surviving brother, which was Humphrey, and in turn his wife Eleanor, by now the Duchess of Gloucester, would become the Queen. But King Henry didn't die, and in 1437 he was declared of age, assumed the reins of government, and began making decisions that clashed with the views of his uncle. It is against this background, when the Duke's fortunes were at a low ebb, Eleanor began consulting astrologers to try to divine what the future held both for her and the king. The astrologers cast two horoscopes, one for the Duchess and the other for King Henry VI, the latter predicting the king would suffer a life-threatening illness during the 20th year of his reign. Unfortunately, rumours of the prediction reached both the king and his advisers, and in due course they were traced back to a trio of clerics and scholars, Roger Bolingbroke, John Hume and Thomas Southwell, who were all members of the Duke of Gloucester's household. The three men were arrested, and both Southwell and Bolingbroke were charged with treasonable necromancy. In this instance, necromancy meant the practice of what we now call the black arts. Bolingbroke in turn named Eleanor as the instigator, so she too was arrested. Eleanor, the Duchess of Gloucester, immediately denied having anything to do with the casting of horoscopes. However, she did concede that she had long time used the services of the Witch of Eye, who had provided her with, in quotes, medicines and drinkies to force the Duke of Gloucester to love her and wed her. Eleanor's confession inevitably resulted in the arrest of Marjorie Jourdain, the Witch of Eye, who now found herself implicated in this intrigue. Incidentally, the Eye in this instance was Eye next to Westminster, a former manor in London that belonged to Westminster Abbey. As to who was Marjorie? Well, over a 10-year period, she had become well known within court circles as one of several women specialising in love magic, dispensing potions, charms and cosmetics to help women secure husbands, fall pregnant and, where necessary, terminate pregnancies. Facing serious charges of witchcraft and treason, Marjorie Jourdain and her fellow accused Thomas Southwell also joined Bolingbroke in claiming Eleanor was the causer and doer of all these deeds. Unfortunately, the evidence was stacking up against the Witch of Eye. The first problem was Bolingbroke was arrested with a wax effigy or puppet doll of the king in his possession that Eleanor is alleged to have made with the assistance of Marjorie, as a rhyme at the time explained. How she in wax, by counsel of the witch, an image made, crowned like a king, which daily they did pitch against a fire, that as the wax did melt, so should his life consume away unfelt. In other words, they were practicing what we now call sympathetic or imitation magic, a ritual using an object, the wax puppet, resembling or symbolically associated with the person over which influence was sought. Thus, as the wax puppet melted, so the life of the king would melt away. In fact, puppets were also used in fertility magic, and Eleanor argued its purpose was entirely innocent and that she had had this puppet made by Marjorie in the hope of having a child by the Duke. What, however, ultimately doomed Marjorie was the discovery that 10 years earlier she had previously been accused of sorcery but released on condition of her future good behaviour and her promise that she would no longer practice witchcraft or necromancy. Yet now, here she was, a decade later, once more clearly engaged in witchcraft. She had relapsed, and in the eyes of the church, this was inexcusable. Marjorie was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. She was found guilty in the Bishop of Canterbury's court of heresy and the long-time practice of witchcraft and sentenced to death by burning. And on the 27th of October she was burned at the stake at Smithfield in the City of London. In case you were wondering, the usual method of executing people convicted of witchcraft in England was death by hanging, but those who were convicted of heresy, as Marjorie was, because she'd lapsed on her previous promises to the church, they were burned at the stake. Was Marjorie Jourdain really guilty of using witchcraft against King Henry? In Shakespeare's version of events, there again, he's not a historian but a playwright with an audience to entertain, Marjorie, along with Bolingbroke, Southwell and Hume, with Eleanor watching from the gallery, all worked together to summon a demon to answer their questions. The reality is Marjorie probably did know Bolingbroke and Southwell because they all moved in the same court circles, and it is also quite clear she had helped Eleanor with love magic for many years. But as for the actual intrigue, if anything, Marjorie was guilty by association, dragged in and implicated when Eleanor tried to save herself by admitting she'd engaged in witchcraft, but only the harmless love magic variety rather than the more serious black magic. However, as already explained, Marjorie was doomed once the authorities realised she had an earlier conviction for sorcery and had relapsed. Still, her fame or infamy lived on after her death. As this little rhyme says, "There was a beldame called the Witch of Eye, old Mother Madge her neighbours did her name, which brought wonders in countries by hearsay. Both fiends and fairies her charming would obey, and dead corpses from graves she would uprear. Such an enchantress that time had no peer." But what about everyone else involved? Now here, history really does echo fiction. In fact, it reads like a particularly bloody episode of the Game of Thrones, with everyone dying. The same day Marjorie Jourdain was burnt at the stake, Thomas Southwell, one of her other accused, died of sorrow in the Tower of London, although a more likely explanation is he committed suicide by poisoning himself. Roger Bolingbroke was not so fortunate. He was found guilty of treasonable felonies and executed on the 18th of November by being hanged, drawn and quartered, with his head subsequently impaled on a spike over London Bridge and his 4 quarters displayed at Oxford, Cambridge, Hereford and York. Turning to Eleanor Cobham, she was initially charged with attempting to encompass the king's death through sorcery and witchcraft, charges she denied. However, on the 9th of November, as a result of what may have been an early form of plea bargain, the charges of heresy and treason were dropped and she was found guilty of merely sorcery and witchcraft. By way of punishment, she was required to do a public penance in London, followed by imprisonment for life. In addition, her marriage to Duke Humphrey was annulled, because, during her trial, she had effectively admitted that she'd used love magic to trick him into marrying her. Eleanor's penance required her to walk, bareheaded and carrying a heavy wax candle, from Temple Bar, the middle of Fleet Street, to St. Paul's Cathedral, where she offered the candle at the high altar. OK, not quite Cersei's walk of shame in the Game of Thrones, but a sufficient public humiliation for a woman who was once just a heartbeat away from becoming the Queen of England. That said, her imprisonment was not as grim as it could have been, as she was granted a pension of 100 marks a year and allowed to keep a household of 12 servants. As for her now ex-husband, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, the Witch of Eye affair totally discredited him. In fact, Eleanor's relatively lenient treatment may have been a tacit acknowledgement that she was just a pawn in a larger game to destroy her husband's political career. Worse was to come 5 years later, when in 1447 Gloucester was accused of treason by King Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou. He was arrested, but 3 days later, before he could be brought to trial, he died. The official version is he died of either a stroke or a heart attack, but there were contemporary rumours, echoed by Shakespeare, that he was poisoned by his enemies. That just leaves the king, Henry VI, and his latter years also turned into a tragedy. The long-running war, the 100 Years' War against France, came disastrously off the rails, and by 1453 the war finally ended, with England losing all its French territories, some of which it had held for nearly 400 years, with the exception of the port of Calais. King Henry suffered a mental breakdown from the shock, and his wife, Queen Margaret, also known as the She-Wolf of France, but that's a story for another day, began to reign on his behalf, with the assistance of various nobles belonging to the Lancastrian branch of the royal house of Plantagenet. Unfortunately, this created friction with the rival Yorkist factions. The dispute turned violent, with the first battle in what subsequently be called the Wars of the Roses. As for King Henry VI's role in the Civil War, he was primarily a passenger swept along by events. He was captured in battle in 1460, deposed in 1461, restored to the throne in 1470, then deposed again in 1471, and then imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he died of melancholy at the still relatively young age of 49. Contemporary rumours and subsequent forensic reports on his remains suggest that he too was murdered. And what of the final conspirator, John Hume, you ask? He was pardoned in 1442 and subsequently returned to his old job as a canon at Hereford Cathedral, and eventually outlived everyone else in this saga, dying comfortably in his bed in 1473. He could just have been very, very lucky. However, it may be, as Shakespeare suggests, he was actually an agent provocateur working for one of the Duke of Gloucester's enemies.
So, are we done with pantomimes and Christmas stories?
Not quite, as today's haunting touches on the subject.
Ah, come on then.
Okay. The location is the Somerset village of Kingston St Mary, and the legend has it that every 5th of January the ghost of a Squire Surtees appears outside Tainfield House, riding a dapple grey horse. The squire then rides circles in the driveway of the house, rattling long chains shackled to his arms. Now, call me a cynic, but this story only emerged in the mid-19th century, at a time when Charles Dickens had, in his ghost story, A Christmas Carol, recently depicted the chained and shackled ghost of Jacob Marley appearing front of Ebenezer Scrooge.
And of course, another curious coincidence is that in the mid-19th century, the most famous horse rider in English fiction was Squire Jorrocks, who's the main character in a series of stories written by Robert Smith Surtees. But I don't see the link to the Christmas connection.
I admit I'm pushing it a bit. It's the ghost in chains which leads us from Squire Surtees to Jacob Marley and on to Ebenezer Scrooge. But did you ever wonder where Dickens got his inspiration for the character Scrooge?
Funnily enough, it's not a question that keeps me awake at night, but I'm sure you're going to cast some light on the mystery.
There are a number of candidates, including a certain John Meggat Ells, a member of Parliament in the 18th century who inherited not one but two fortunes, worth in total over £26 million in today's prices, but apparently was such a tight-fisted miser he once found a beggar's cast-off wig in a hedge and wore it for 2 weeks.
Wait a second, you are saying that 250 years ago even the beggars wore wigs in the UK?
Apparently so. I don't know whether it was cold weather or what. But yes, wigs for beggars. Anyway, the past is a foreign country and they do things differently. However, my money on who the real basis for Scrooge was is a character called James or Jemmy Wood. He was still alive during Dickens' early life. In fact, he only died 7 years before A Christmas Carol was published, and was so famous in his lifetime they even made pottery Toby jugs and Staffordshire china figures depicting him. If he'd been alive today, there'd been a social media star and had his own TV show. Jemmy actually inherited not just a fortune, but a whole bank, the Gloucester Old Bank, which is now part of the Lloyds banking group, and was said to be worth the equivalent of £72 million, which makes poor old John Meggat Ells sound very minor. Despite his wealth, Jemmy was a notorious miser. He'd wear the same clothes for years on end, and rather than buy fuel, he would visit Gloucester docks and fill his pockets with small pieces of coal that had fallen onto the quayside as boats were being unloaded. And rather than pay for the cost of a carriage, he'd walk everywhere. One story says he even managed to get a lift back from Gloucester to Tewkesbury by catching a lift in the back of a passing horse-drawn hearse lying in the space usually reserved for the coffin. When he died, shades of the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come's revelation to Scrooge, the crowd at his funeral were described as evincing a levity of demeanour inconsistent with the solemnity of the occasion, i.e. they were laughing, and they also stoned his coffin. As well as Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, there's a character called Dismal Jemmy in the Pickwick Papers. Jemmy Wood of Gloucester is mentioned in Our Mutual Friend, and it's suggested the Jarndyce vs Jarndyce court case in Bleak House may have been inspired by the litigation that arose from the irregularities in Jemmy Wood's own will.
Still, at least he didn't go round wearing wigs that had been discarded by tramps. I mean, my head feels all itchy just thinking about it. Ugh.
Almost time to go, but before we do, we really do need to say something about those New Year's Eve traditions we were all celebrating just a few days ago. You know, singing Rabbie Burns' Auld Lang Syne, or at least singing the chorus, while mumbling the rest of the words and simultaneously doing that weird linked crossed arm waving thing. Purists, please note, technically you should only cross arms for the final verse and chorus. That's the one that goes, "And there's a hand, my trusty friend, and gear's a hand of thine. I will take a right good willy wort for Auld Lang Syne." A willy wort, should you be wondering, is a glass of Scotch whisky. Anyway, a recent survey found that 42% of millennials, that's people aged between 18 and 24, in the UK, don't know a single word of the song. 56% didn't know who wrote it, and 3% of those who thought they knew who wrote it said it was written by Mariah Carey. However, just let's pause for a little bit of urban myth-busting. You see, Robert Burns did not write Auld Lang Syne. His contribution was to collect together and record in writing, for the first time, a raft of old Scottish folk songs and poems that would have otherwise have been lost when the oral tradition died out. One of the songs he recorded in the year 1788 was Auld Lang Syne. It was, said Burns, an old song of the olden times, which has never been in print, nor even in manuscript, until I took it down from an old man. He did make the contribution of, in his words, tidying up some of the words and adding 3 more verses. Personally, I prefer the words and sentiments of an old North Country, possibly Northumbrian folk song. The lyrics have been tidied up by me, and you can sing it to the tune of the old Strawbs hit, "You Can't Get Me, I'm Part of the Union." For the company makes the feast, my friend, and the music weaves a spell. Songs and stories, pipes and fiddle, friends we all know well. And every act is noted, from masterpiece to least. Heart and cheer for a brave new year, the company makes the feast. Janie and I look forward to your company when we return in a fortnight with more weird tales from the world of ghosts, folklore, urban myths, witchcraft and magic.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com,